This episode of Rift's Rants is Rift's Ranged Combat and Rules as Written. That's a lot of R's, isn't it? Hi, this is Off to Battle, and while taking care of some other business, I wrote scripts for two other podcasts about the magic balancing in Rifts, and I'll still do those because it's only much later than the main book era that brought me into Rifts that the balancing softened a little. But today's subject is more important. I'll say more about that at the end, but basically, I want my podcast to be about love of the hobby and nothing else. So it is useful to focus on the right things. In doing research for this series, I've read a lot and I've asked some questions about specific things. I've had people give it to me raw, and one of the questions was what this acronym meant. Well, it means rules as written. The thing is, my memories suggested I had a pretty good grasp of the rules as written back in the main book, but something seemed off when I was looking at pieces from different games I didn't have access to in my younger years. I was tracking down a narrower issue based on half-remembered stuff and bumped into the Rift's Game Master's Guide. This told me what I'm talking to you about right now. The Game Master Guide encapsulated a lot that Kevin was putting into the system, but something that was inarguably new was also implemented as of the time of Rifts Japan, which I bought, being a Japanese interest kind of guy, and which shouldn't surprise any of you recognizing the kanji for battle in my logo and stuff. I understood how ranged combat worked earlier than that just fine, but I couldn't remember that fact until staring at this years later. The ranged combat changed, and is like a Protestant schism. There's before the change and after the change. It's difficult to read earlier and later books and square them cleanly because of that change, and hey, yeah, some of your Unlimited Edition stuff was meant to drag things forward as well as the completely legit reason of wanting to sell more books. It's a business, I completely understand and sympathize. So it's with the addition of these new rules that we have several big features. One is a fat and massive negative modifier to dodging missile weapons, from throwing stars to arrows to bullets to laser beams, in ascending order of severity. And I've come back from the future to edit this to point out that bonuses to dodge from hand-to-hand or physical prowess are made illegal and unusable for the purposes of this game mechanic. But, people will point out, since you don't get to use physical prowess bonuses to strike, and by the way, this is important, that's not in the main book. It wasn't there. It didn't exist. Yet. It's not that I misread. It's that it wasn't there to be read by my careful, late-teen eyes. So on top of that, you have an expansion, in effect, of what counts as wild shooting. And I'll call this, in general, the adrenaline is your enemy rule, which is totally something I came up with for ease of presentation. Basically, the same high stats that make you a combat god with a sword make you shoot worse unless you consciously force yourself to shoot properly. So a lot more attacks won't even have to be dodged. They'll just miss, which is most certainly not how the original rules worked, either as written or in practice. I'm shoving in between points 2 and 3, a relatively minor point because it was the subject of my first podcast episode, Simultaneous Attack, Destroyer of Worlds. Now, I was mainly saying that it had room for big-time abuse, but there's also abuse the other way. I get that. You shouldn't be the red cape taunting the glitter boy bull with your little laser pistol and dance around his boom gun shots willy-nilly. The question would have been if existing rules can deal with that without the need to apply simultaneous attack to ranged combat. But in the GMG, Kevin makes plain his way of balancing it, and that's that simultaneous attack pulls you up in the combat order, but this is not a free attack. Did I ever think that it was? I have my doubts, but anyway. If it costs you your next attack, that means you're getting a so-called advantage, but you're burning through your armor and your attacks, unless, of course, your attacker shot wild and missed you. A boom gun simultaneously attacking a guy who missed? Yeah. Maybe I was still right about Destroyer of Worlds, but at least I want you to understand there was an intention behind that rule, and I'm giving it context. And so we will come back to it later. The third major point was saying that most energy weapons cannot burst. This is something that goes back to my Robotech days. I agonized over this so badly. Put simply, at the start of Robotech, you had stuff out of Heroes Unlimited revised. Handheld laser weapons were experimental, and would overheat after 4 shots in one 15-second melee round. Which is funny because until the extra attacks became a universal part of the system, 4 shots were a lot. But those were also single shots. You couldn't burst at all with them. Well, there was nothing saying you couldn't once you got to Southern Cross and had early mega damage handheld weapons. Now, that might not matter as much if you're one-on-oneing a robot, but let's say it's 20-on-1 and you ambush it. What, you burn through the entire cliffs in the first few seconds and rip it into tiny mecha pieces? Well, what was stopping you? More to the point, wasn't it the right tactic? And aside from the laser resistance, why wouldn't you do the same to Glitter Boys? The thing is, was it meant this way? It wasn't an explicit rule. It's more like an accidental result from having the rules applying to AK-47s apply to laser pistols too. It's not simply a matter of clip size. Come on, that was easy to work around if you wanted to. It's an issue of damage balance. And I mentioned the clip size because Kevin cites that for reworking the rules, but you can work it out other ways. Here's the thing, and I want this off my chest. Within its own anime universe, Robotech stuff is SDC. MDC is useful as a game concept, but anime didn't make this magical fine line between a handheld laser weapon and a mecha handheld rifle, so long as both actually existed within the same universe. Small holes in armor could easily happen without bringing down the entire machine. It wasn't like a tank, because as the word implies, the crew of a tank is in a compartment, and in real life, penetrating the compartment means game over. The crew loses. Having a cockpit as part of a giant robot means that you can be shot in the robot's chest, and it mangles the robot, but the pilot is still kicking. Battle damage is a thing. Anything that promotes drama gets used. Mega damage capacity is not something I object to as a game contrivance at all, but it's an adaptation, not the original stuff that wouldn't splice hairs that finely. If a human actually could fire a laser cannon from over the shoulder, then it stands to her. So if you want an anime that deals with effects of armor in a more blatant sense, watch Gundam. But that's because even early mecha-fired weapons couldn't penetrate the titular piloted robot. Later stuff did real damage, and regularly. It's anime. It's drama. We're just working with it. I'm saying this because you're going to find things in anime that do not cleanly fit into our Palladium conceits of aimed shots, bursts, and wildfire. It no longer bothers me because we're no longer dealing with on-foot humans with only 2 attacks. So a group in cover firing at aliens over yonder doesn't look silly in game terms where it might otherwise have done so before. The point being, this was an unresolved issue. And because it was unresolved until time was taken to consciously change the ranged combat rules, and I know I wasn't dreaming this up, the solution chosen was deliberate. It's enough to convince me that the original situation was largely an accident, a product of systems clashing without stopping to take the time and say, no, it shouldn't work like this. But later, they did. It's just that this is rough on people who come from the main book era and who may have made assumptions about weapon use and weapon power because of this accident of fate. It should have been resolved back in Robotech Southern Cross, to be perfectly blunt. But the point being, we have to accept this. Sometimes, the rules as written can be read properly, but you cannot read a rule that is not there. So it clashes with later books. This is a result of the aspiration of a universal game with multiple settings crashing against the hard, pointy rocks of flawed human beings. So, I take away that I should be humble and gentle. I hope that's everybody's take. It probably isn't, but this is mine. Now, having created a system of checks and balances for both attacker and defender, we come to the issue that I first encountered staring me in the face in Rifts Japan. Classes that are exceptions to these rules. The true samurai can attempt to parry even laser blast because we're going for an Okure Jidai feel, which means anachronistic, which itself means belonging to a bygone era. a Jedi feel, if you will. You also have ninja dodging arrows, and this became a thing for the longbowmen in Palladium Fantasy 2nd Edition. So you had people being, well, Hawkeye or Green Arrow. Not that I have a problem with that. I'm just saying you start out with negatives thrown out like they're going out of fashion, and then provide less negatives to particular classes. Then you introduce weapon proficiency sharpshooter to let people apply their physical prowess bonuses to their 2-strike rolls again and make trick shots that would be considered wild for other people, which means you're not only potentially adding bonuses but wiping out negatives too. Then you're putting the OCCs that are supposed to be getting the stuff gate locked behind new books. It's kind of like paid DLC. I'll come back to this other times, but basically you're saying that the rest of you guys are all chumps. The only folks that can really fight are the really cool ones, and you ain't it. Get the new books and get with the program, suckers. Something like that. So yeah, I get some of that, but I also have a polite disagreement because I was staring at this back then with Rift Japan as a GM. And even though it was the rest of life that made me have to walk away from the hobby, except for private stuff, and I've essentially GM'd for individuals, not groups, for a lot of years, okay? A lot of years. But that is another story. Point is, I looked at this as a GM and recoiled in horror at all the extra work it was. So number one, just to get this out of the way, this is like double negatives in English grammar. My instinct is to cut them out and use a sentence without them. I'm a Japanese to English translator in so-called real life. Japanese as a language has a greater love of double negatives than English. Not all the time, and less the older I get, it seems, but I've seen them, I've dealt with them, some authors just like them. If 2 negatives on opposing sides of an opposed dice roll are in play, my deep desire is to not have separate sets of cheat sheets and guides open everywhere around me or other windows in my browser over a computer. I want to cut out the negativity, the negative dice rolls, and give bonuses to the privileged few OCCs that are supposed to get the less negatives, quote-unquote, to do something, like dodging arrows like your Hawkeye or Green Arrow. And come on. We know that you introduce stuff like this, and the need to be cool means that people are going to try and shove to the front of the line and take the cool stuff just to brag about it. So I'm not going to count on this stuff being rare. Not in practice. Note that I have zero intention of weakening these OCCs. None. At all. I'm just trying to help GMs survive the combat as the referees, because it's a huge inflation of the work, where you had a pretty elegant system originally. It took a lot of preparation, but once that preparation was done, you were pretty darn good until you leveled up several times and had to adjust some values. But hey, people enjoy leveling. It's a core part of the role-playing experience. The other thing, and the real point of this entire journey, is to ask, why? Why do this? Why was it changed? Let's Occam's razor this and find the simplest plausible explanation. The creator wanted people to dodge less. He wanted people to resort to simultaneous strike more. He wanted to resolve fights through people taking actual damage to themselves. He was essentially sitting in his GM's chair saying, it's combat. You're supposed to get hit. You're supposed to take damage. It's part of the game. And ironically, the only way to try and guarantee that you aren't going to be nickeled and dimed by these rules is to get into melee combat as quickly as possible, where even with the toning down of energy weapons, allowing only 2-shot bursts unless it's a pulse weapon specifically, or in extremely rare cases, that again required new books, left you with melee combat that tended to do a lot less damage, and therefore required more attacks left and right to resolve. But at least people could simultaneously attack each other and guarantee damage to the other side. So people with tankier setups were able to inflict damage regularly, and people with dodgier setups were punished regularly as the price of getting into combat at all. Again, we get into my original criticism of this, that it makes the defender the god of battle, and that no one wanting to fight smart who's wearing a suit of armor or high NDC robot would dare attack first. But this is a creator who's spoken fondly of groups with 8 to 12 players, and that it only really gets messy when they're above 20. and 30 is too much to handle. Well, I'd love to see a group like that in the flesh, but I fear I will be in the grave before I ever do. Point being, I get why he feels this way, and people need to pay a damage tax to fight. But to me, a guy who wouldn't be running more than a smallish group regardless at best. I mean, certainly not 10 to 12, most likely. It feels like you rewrote some of the classes because they were annoying. The problem is, when you're not a glitter boy, that's a feature, not a bug. You are the bug. Or the hornet, dancing like a butterfly and stinging like a hornet. Because it keeps its stinger and can sting multiple times. Bees might be a rough example. Stinging you is a one-way mission for the bee. Sometimes you gotta take one for the hive. I didn't plan that one, it just kind of happened. So to me, you can't understand this rule change without trying to understand the intent behind it. It doesn't obligate me to agree with that intent. But yes, circling back, what happens in fast-moving combat is that fewer people have to attempt to dodge, and thus lose an attack. And then when you do have to attempt to dodge, and thus lose an attack, your odds of success are horrifically low, and don't even allow you to use combat bonuses while piloting a thruster-assisted flying suit of power armor to help you dodge. The only possible helps the speed has is in penalties to the attacker. So you are going to take damage, and it's going to make longevity in combat difficult. It's going to savage your finances if you survive, and a certain kind of GM will find it wondrous and glorious for sure. But the players are going to hate you like your head looks like that of a cockroach. Sorry to cockroaches, by the way. Yeah, you think you mutant animal players have it bad now? Roll up a character who is a humanoid cockroach. Let me know if you survive to reach level 2. Kidding, not kidding. They say humans don't have instincts, but ahem. Anyway. Point is, I get what he's going for. Enough. But then, as a consequence, outside of pure melee combat, what's the point of having high physical prowess? None. And maybe that's the point. Or none unless you play very particular classes. Prestige classes, earned through paying for the right books. And your GM better have access to those books too. So I'm saying with a lot of thought and consideration that I just politely disagree. I don't think, having lived with an abstract system for all this time, that I'm going to return to the hobby and have physical prowess not matter except for pure melee combat. And I mean pure because you can still be shot in the gut with a laser sidearm at 5 feet away while closing into melee. More to the point, why are we even rolling for a lot of these fights? I'm saying that as someone who's done diceless GMing for many years now. If fights are basically... Okay, mode number 1 is ambush, where you sneak attack, and with rare exception, you're hitting everything you fire at because you're not an idiot, and you have an overwhelming advantage. Mode number 2 is a knife fight, a brawl. And in a knife fight, both sides get hurt. Everyone is getting hit on both sides because in that kind of situation, loss of an attack is suicidal. You can't make that up. You have to burn the enemy down before you get burned down. You're going to take damage. You're just praying and relying on whatever OP stuff you brought, that your effective hit points are on top by the time your damage output reduces the enemy to slag. If the fight is effectively controlled by he who simultaneously attacks, then you should go in with the attitude that every fight is a DPS check, and your armor is there to distinguish you from the peons, or your demigod and your natural toughness is there to distinguish you from mere mortals. Same diff. Why do we even have parry, dodge, and the oft-forgotten entangle? Why do we have them? The really funny thing is that this Game Master's Guide provided me with justification for a tweak I argued with people more than once, and they didn't think it was going to fly. But that's for another episode. Rather, in that context, I'll talk about what brought me to this. When I started this, I knew the day would come when I get chewed out for it. Well, I have been, and at a stage where I've barely done anything, because I've joined that esteemed company known as You People. That is, you people think the mechanics are broken? No, they're just poorly written and presented. Maybe you'd understand the rules if you bothered to read them. You want to, quote-unquote, fix Palladium, and no one fixes Palladium, because fixes are just your own opinions, and everyone has them. See, I came to this reading a ton, asking some questions, trying to keep them targeted and narrow, to try and not be that guy. And instead I've been nominated to become those people, a faceless, nameless conspirator of a vast conspiracy against the Palladium system. And my opinion doesn't matter because it's just an opinion, not merely no more valid than anyone else, but far less because I and all my ilk are illiterate brutes who, and this is a specific point, break things more in the course of supposedly fixing, quote unquote, something because we are illiterate brutes, obviously. The timing was funny because I was recovering from a deadline day. I didn't see the message until 17 hours later, and immediately after finding the part above in the Game Master's Guide that I spoke of just now, which is why that I've placed things in this order. I try to make a point not to podcast angry, ever, or to bring out the implications that I hear in my own head, but which weren't written specifically. The content is clear enough, though, but the thing is, this guy changed my mind, and not in the way that he meant to. Rules as written. Raw. As I said at the start, I discovered that I was not illiterate. I was not stupid. I was remembering rules as they were written before they were rewritten. I have a right to compare before and after because I lived that era. I was there. I have a right to an opinion. I have a right to discern the intent of the changes and how they affect games I want to run. I have a duty to figure out what works for me and what does not. Because if I ever run games again, I owe that to my players. And I have a responsibility to not just learn of the past, but learn from the past. Like I said, even if it was just an issue of cleaning up the extra number crunching busy work for the GM, not the die rolls, but the metric ton of suck that comes from juggling all the modifiers, True Samurai will still rock. And by the way, I like them. But I recognize that the point of the rule is not simply to make True Samurai get struck more, but to make sure everyone else gets struck a lot more. And to the point that the absolute worst thing that can happen in combat is for you to lose an attack for any reason. Short of an automatic parry, the only way to play is to stand and fight, stand and shoot, and keep shooting until only one side is left standing. Anything else is suicide, because losing the attack in defending yourself will not only get you killed much of the time, it will get your buddies killed the vast majority of the time. So even the weakest, lowliest, scrawniest coalition foot soldier will be taught to plant his feet, raise his rifle, and shoot, and keep shooting until the enemy's dead and you're standing. Hopefully. Maybe. The only reason at that point to savage the burst fire is to make that something players can survive while still ensuring that they take damage against logical opponents using simultaneous attack to rob them of chances to dodge, even at the pathetic, wretched levels their odds already are. And this turns whatever magic you can manage to cast from the shadows into a game changer in the sense that disabling that negatives to strike that any way to prevent your side from having to dodge gives you a geometric increase in battle advantage, because with enough firepower, no normal opposition is going to survive 10 seconds. Literally 10 seconds of game time. This is a choice. I don't need to play this way, and I don't need to run a game this way. You don't have to either if you don't want to. It's just to say, I found the old rules to have their little flaws, most of which were addition control issues, or insufficient aggression in balancing when mashing settings together. None of these are unsolvable, but the nature of my real-life work and my personality generally makes me look at things intently, and then find the least damaging, least wrecking, least breaking, most surgical solution possible. So yeah, you can call me a butcher. I call myself a surgeon of words. It's what I do. I put this at the end because, to be blunt, I don't need a defense. I'd have to feel guilty about doing something wrong to need a defense. I approached this the right way. I read. I asked carefully calibrated questions. And then I found where and when things changed into the current system. And now I look at the Rift's main book and its era in a new light. Learn not just of the past, but learn from the past. I have nothing to apologize for, and I'm not going to act like I do. I'll be going back to Plan A, and the next podcast episodes will be all about the magic stuff in Rifts as it came out in the main book and has only been somewhat tweaked since then. But again, I'm coming from a position of love, not hate. I don't seek to butcher. I seek to make better use of the awesome setting and world building that was done by creative minds. That's what brought me in, and that's what has me returning back, wiser and better prepared to take a few dislocated joints and pop them back into place so that they function as limbs going forward. And there's nothing wrong with that. Take care. Have fun out there.